They said the Lorne ranch was where silence went to bury its dead. No neighbors for miles, no wife in the house, just a widower with calloused hands and eyes that didn't blink at storms, and a gate that hadn't swung open in years. But one. Morning, just after dawn, broke like a blade across the Wyoming hills. A woman stepped through it. She wasn't much to look at. Clothes torn from the road, face too pale. A baby clutched against her chest like a shield. She didn't speak. When she knocked, didn't flinch when he answered the door holding a rifle. She just handed him a slip of paper. Old, worn, almost forgotten. You said you needed a cook. That's how it started. Not with a kiss, not with a gunfight, not even with a name, but with a door creaking open and a past creeping in, because that woman, Ellie Monroe, wasn't just hungry or tired or broke. She was being hunted, and the man who'd offered her a job didn't yet know he'd just stepped into a story with no way out, not unless he was willing to fight for something again, not unless he could remember how. If you felt that tug in your chest, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. This channel brings you raw emotional Western stories every day, and trust me, you won't want to miss how this one ends. Chapter 1. The Woman at the Gate. The wind hadn't spoken in days, and Grady Lorne took that as both a blessing and a warning. He stood on the porch of his homestead, mug of weak coffee steaming in his hand, watching the horizon like it owed him something. The chill of early spring clung to the ridges around his ranch, turning the sagebrush brittle and the sky wide with silence. It was the kind of quiet that stretched, pulled, threatened to snap. He'd been alone too long, long enough to know the signs, long enough to understand when something was coming. The horses had started to spook 2 days ago, just a twitch here, a backward ear there, the kind of unease that set into animals before storms or trouble. Grady didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in signs, and something about the windless days had his gut twisted like wire. He took another sip from the tin mug, then heard it. Footsteps. Not many people had reason to come this far. His land lay 5 miles off the main road, over a rocky bluff and past the riverbed. It wasn't marked, wasn't mapped. That's how he liked it. But someone was walking up the trail. He set the mug down slow, reached behind the door, and pulled. The shotgun from its hook. Just one shell loaded. If they meant trouble, one would be enough to send a message. She came into view like a ghost, pulled from dust. A woman, young, maybe mid-20s, but the kind of young that comes worn down and hungry. Her boots were cracked at the toe, her skirt dirty from the road. One arm cradled a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. A baby! Grady stepped forward, letting the screen door slam behind him. The sound made the woman flinch, but she didn't stop. He lowered the barrel slightly. You lost? She didn't answer. Just walked up the last bit of trail, legs trembling. Beneath her, at the foot of the steps, she reached into her coat with a shaking hand and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Grady took it. The paper was torn at the edge, spotted with dried mud. It was his own handwriting, faded but clear. Help wanted, cook, room and board, quiet place, no questions asked. Apply in person, G. Lorne, Cold Ridge, Wyoming. He blinked. That notice had been pinned in a backwater post office nearly 6 months ago. He'd forgotten he ever wrote it. The woman didn't speak, but her eyes did. They were hollow with exhaustion, but steady. The kind of eyes that had seen too much and learned not to flinch. Her grip tightened on the baby, who let out a soft whimper, like even it knew the air here didn't welcome strangers easily. Grady stepped aside. Come in. She nodded once. Just once. Then climbed the steps, slow and careful. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and ash. The fire was low. A single cot sat against the far wall. The stove hadn't been lit since the day before. Dust clung to the corners like a secret. The woman stood near the hearth, rocking the baby slightly. Grady set the shotgun back on its hook, Name? She hesitated. Then, Ellie. You cook? A nod. The child yours? Another nod. Grady scratched his jaw. This wasn't what he'd expected, but then again, he hadn't expected much. He'd written the EHAW, notice more out of restlessness than need. I've got one room, he said. You can have the cot. Baby too. You cook, clean, and keep to yourself. I don't ask questions, and you don't give me reason to. Ellie looked at him, then slowly nodded. Her lips parted like she might speak, but no words came. He pointed toward the far corner. There's water in the basin. Firewood's stacked. Out back. Stove takes kindling quick. She moved like someone afraid to wake the dead. Grady watched her settle the baby onto the cot, unwrap the cloth gently. A boy, newborn, maybe a month old, pale and thin but breathing steady. Ellie stroked his cheek, then turned back to the stove. Without another word, she began to work. By sundown, the cabin smelled of cornbread and rabbit stew. Grady sat at the table, watching as she moved between pot and hearth with practiced grace. She didn't speak, didn't smile. But her hands didn't shake any more. When the meal was done, she served him first, then took a bowl for herself and ate sitting near the cradle. The firelight caught the curve of her jaw, the thin scar that ran beneath her left ear. Grady noticed, but didn't ask. He'd meant what he said, no questions, but as he finished the last bite of stew, he realized something strange had settled into the room. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was something like it, something close. He pushed back from the table. You'll be safe here, he said quietly. Ellie looked up, startled. He nodded to the baby. Both of you. She stared at him for a moment, then whispered, Thank you. It was the first full sentence she'd spoken. And in the stillness that followed, Grady felt something shift inside him. The wind picked up outside. A distant coyote howled, and in that little cabin, a man who'd given up on second chances poured himself another cup of coffee, wondering what the hell he'd just let into his life. Chapter 2. Quiet corners and cracked porcelain. The sun rose over the Lorne ranch with a haze of dust and frost, painting the distant hills in pale amber and brittle blue. Ellie Monroe stood at the cabin window, baby in her arms, watching it spill across the land. Her boy, just 2 months old, sucked quietly on the worn edge of a cloth, half asleep, eyes fluttering beneath their lids. The house smelled of dry wood and boiled oats. The fire in the hearth had burned low during the night, and Ellie was careful not to wake the rancher as she stoked it back to life. Her arms moved with practiced ease, though her muscles ached with the memory of train benches and wagon jolts, with the miles she'd walked before the final one that brought her here. Grady Lorne hadn't said more than a few words since she'd arrived the day before. He'd shown her the small room behind the kitchen, nodded toward the pump and the woodpile, then disappeared to tend to his cattle. Ellie didn't blame him. She didn't want conversation either, not yet. She'd taken the job because there was no other choice. Not because she thought she'd be welcomed, not because she believed she'd be safe. She listened for footsteps, but the house was still. So she dressed the baby in layers and carried him outside. The wind bit her cheeks crisp and dry, but the sun promised a slow thaw. The ranch stretched far and flat, ringed by wind-warped trees and broken fence lines. Chickens pecked near the coop. 2 cows grazed beyond the corral, their breath fogging. In the morning air, Ellie breathed in deep. No smoke, no sirens, no shouts, just wind, just sky. She stayed outside until the baby fussed, then slipped back into the cabin and fed him near the hearth. The child's hunger had become her compass, his needs, her purpose. She had nothing else. By mid-morning, Grady came in from the fields. His boots tracked dust and snowmelt across the floorboards, but Ellie said nothing. She merely rose, handed him a tin cup of coffee, and went back to her cleaning. He took it with a grunt. "You find everything all right?" he asked. She nodded. "If the pump freezes, there's a spigot in the barn." "Thank you." He nodded again and rubbed the back of his neck, like he regretted speaking. Then he stepped outside again. Ellie waited until the door shut before she let out a breath. She worked through the afternoon, cleaning out the pantry, boiling potatoes, hanging a cloth over the drafty crack in her bedroom wall. The baby watched her from a basket Grady had hastily lined with horse blankets. She whispered stories to him as she worked. Nonsense stories. Made-up tales about rivers made of milk and owls who wore spectacles. She didn't know if he understood, but the sound of her voice kept him calm, and maybe it kept her sane. At dusk, Grady returned. He said nothing as he removed his coat, washed his hands, and sat at the table. Ellie served him rabbit stew and bread she'd found wrapped in a muslin cloth. He didn't thank her, but he ate. Every bite. When he finished, he stood slowly. "I'll take the night barn shift." "Snow's coming," she nodded. "I'll bank the fire." He paused at the door. "The stew was good." She looked up. "Thank you," he said. Then he was gone. Ellie stared at the empty bowl a long while. Then she cleaned it with hot water and ash and went to bed. The next day passed the same, and the one after. But small things began to change. Grady started asking how the baby was doing. "He's growing," she said one evening. "You name him yet?" She hesitated. "Sam, after my uncle." He nodded. "Strong name." The next day she found a bag of oats by the kitchen door. A small jar of honey followed. Then a carved spoon. Nothing was said. But she noticed. He still worked the land like a man who owed it something, still kept to himself, but when he came in each night, he paused to ask how she was, and when she answered, however briefly, he listened. After a week, she started singing to the baby, soft lullabies from her childhood. She thought Grady couldn't hear, but once, passing the door, he paused. She saw his shadow stretch long across the floorboards. He stood there until the song ended, then kept walking. 2 weeks passed. Snow fell, then melted, then fell again. Ellie swept it off the porch each morning, her arms strong now, her back straighter. The baby fattened on oats and goat milk. He smiled more. Grady brought home a second goat, said the first needed company. Then one night the quiet broke. A knock came at the door after supper. Grady opened it, rifle in hand. 2 men stood on the porch, drifters, faces shadowed, eyes hungry. "Cold out," one said. "Not my problem," Grady answered. "We got coin." Grady's eyes flicked to Ellie. She had stepped into the corner, clutching Sam to her chest. Her face had gone pale. Grady saw it. "No room," he said, voice flat. The men hesitated, then backed away. When the door shut, Grady turned to Ellie. "You all right?" She nodded, but her hands were shaking. "You know them?" "No," she said, "but I've known men like them." He didn't push. That night he sat in a chair near the fire, rifle across his lap. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Ellie slept soundly. 3 weeks in, she found herself telling him a story. It wasn't much. Just a memory of her mother baking cinnamon bread, singing over a cracked radio. But it made Grady smile. "You bake?" he asked. "Not well." "I'll eat anything that doesn't break a tooth," she laughed. A short sound surprised out of her. It felt like something starting. He showed her the root cellar, the hunting, traps, the high shelf in the barn where the snowshoes were kept. She told him Sam had colic, that she was scared of coyotes, that her first job had been in a diner where the wall shook when trains passed. The porch became their meeting place. Each evening after supper, after Sam was asleep, they sat with coffee or tea, watching the stars emerge. "You ever been married?" she asked him one night. He nodded. "Once." "What happened?" "Cancer. Slow kind. I'm sorry." "Me too." They didn't speak again that night, but the next morning she found a second blanket folded on her bed and a book of poems on the shelf that hadn't been there before. The 4th week brought trouble. Grady went into town for supplies and came back tense. Ellie saw it in his eyes. "Someone asking about a woman with a baby," he said. "Back east accent." Her heart dropped. "Did you tell—" "No." She backed against the wall, clutching Sam. "I won't let anyone take him," she said, voice shaking. Grady's gaze didn't waver. "I know." That night she told him more. Not everything, but enough. About Greeley, about the lies, the forged documents, the bruises that never healed, the night she ran, blood still drying under her fingernails. Grady didn't ask questions. He just sat beside her, hands clasped. "You're safe now," he said. "Not just 'cause I say so, but 'cause I'll make it so." She believed him. For the first time in her life, she believed a man when he said she was safe. And when he stood to leave, she touched his sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered. He paused, then covered her hand with his. "Any man who tries to take your boy'll have to get through me first?" She nodded, because in the quiet of that cabin, surrounded by wood smoke and stars, a truth had rooted deep. Sometimes the strongest walls weren't built of stone. They were built of silence, slowly filled with trust. And Ellie Monroe, broken, brave Ellie, was beginning to believe that home wasn't just a place. It was a person who stayed. Morning broke soft and golden, the kind of light that seemed to apologize for the cold. Frost clung to the fence rails, and the last stars faded slow behind the hills. Inside the cabin, Ellie stirred first. The baby was nestled against her chest, warm and still breathing deep. For a moment she stayed that way, savoring the silence. Grady had already gone outside. She heard the steady rhythm of an axe striking wood. Measured, sure. It was a sound that had become oddly comforting. She laid Samuel in the cradle, wrapped in the quilt, and slipped on her boots. Her shawl was worn, the threads thinning near the shoulder, but it still kept the chill out. When she stepped onto the porch, Grady didn't stop. He just glanced at her, then went back to chopping. "Morning," she said. He grunted. Then, after a beat, "You sleep?" She nodded. "Better?" A few more swings. Then he wiped his brow and leaned on the axe handle. "I was thinking of riding out to Widow Hollow this afternoon. There's a man there who does leather work. I need new straps for the south gate. You want me to start something for supper?" "Only if you're staying," she blinked. "You want me to come?" He nodded. "It ain't much of a trip. 2 hours there. I got room on the wagon." There was a long pause. Then she said, "I'll get Samuel bundled." The road to Widow Hollow twisted between ridges and pines, the trail narrow but well worn. Grady drove the wagon while Ellie sat beside him, baby in her lap, wrapped in a thick shawl. The boy didn't cry much, just watched the trees with wide, serious eyes. They passed 3 riders going east. Grady tipped his hat. The riders nodded, polite but curious. Ellie turned her face slightly away, shielding Samuel. "Folks around here ain't unkind," Grady said quietly, "but they talk, like anywhere. I'm used to it. They see a baby, they see a story." She didn't reply, just shifted. Samuel, slightly, her hand tightening on the bundle. Widow Hollow was a hamlet more than a town. A blacksmith, a tinker, a single-room schoolhouse, and a mercantile. Smoke curled from chimneys, and children chased chickens between fences. Grady pulled the wagon up beside the general store. "I'll see about the leather," he said. "You want anything?" Ellie hesitated. "Needle and thread, if they have it." He nodded. "Take your time." She stepped out and carried Samuel into the store. A bell above the door jingled. A woman behind the counter looked up, her eyes traveling from Ellie's face to the child. "Morning," the woman said, polite but distant. "Morning," Ellie replied. She wandered the aisle slowly. Took longer than she needed to. She didn't want to draw attention, but something in her chest tightened the longer she stood there. A sense of being watched. It wasn't until she turned to leave that she saw the man. Tall, narrow-shouldered, blue coat, clean-shaven. Her heart stopped. He wasn't looking at her. He was talking to the woman at the counter, asking after tobacco. But she knew him. Not his name, maybe. But the kind of man he was, the kind who traveled with others, the kind who worked for Greeley. She left without buying a thing. Outside, Grady was tying leather strips to the wagon bed. "We have to go," she said. He looked up, saw her face, the tightness. "Trouble?" "Could be." He didn't ask more, just helped her into the wagon and snapped the reins. The ride back was quiet. tense. Halfway up the ridge, Grady slowed the wagon. "You know him?" he asked. She didn't look at him, just nodded. "One of Greeley's?" She hesitated. Then, "Maybe. He followed me once, when I left." "He see you?" "I don't know." Grady didn't say anything else, but his jaw clenched. Back at the cabin, she set Samuel down and began packing what little she had. Grady stepped inside, saw the bag, and frowned. "What are you doing?" "We can't stay. You said you didn't know if he saw you?" "Doesn't matter. If he was sent west, he's close." Grady crossed the room in 2 steps, took her hand. "This is your place now. You've got a roof, food, someone who gives a damn. You run again, you lose all that. I can't let him find Samuel. Then we make sure he doesn't." She looked at him. The room was so quiet she could hear the kettle ticking on the stove. "You'd stay?" she asked. "You'd fight?" He didn't blink. "For you?" "Yes." She let the bag fall. The wind outside picked up again, rattling the shutters. But inside, something held firm. The clouds rolled in heavy that night, low and leaden, smearing the moon like a thumbprint on glass. The stove hissed quietly as pine logs spit and cracked. Ellie stood by the window, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the barn. Grady was in the back room, oiling his rifle. He hadn't said much since she'd told him about the man in Widow Hollow. He didn't need to. There was a new tension in him, not anger, but a quiet readiness, like an old wolf who'd caught a scent on the wind and knew the hunt would come soon. Samuel stirred in the cradle, fussing. Ellie crossed the room, lifted him gently, and pressed him close. Her hand stroked his hair while her eyes never left the window. "Storm's coming," Grady said as he returned, rifle slung, revolver belted to his hip. "I know," she said. But she wasn't talking about weather. The next morning, Grady saddled both horses. He loaded the rifle, extra rounds, jerky, a flask, and a field kit into his saddlebag. Ellie came out holding Samuel, bundled and sleeping. "You going hunting?" she asked. "Sort of." She looked down at the child. "You're expecting them." "I'm hoping not. But I'm ready if they come." He mounted the horse, took the reins, and turned toward her. "Keep the rifle near. If I don't come back by nightfall, take the back trail to Widow Rock and wait." She nodded, her face pale but determined. Grady rode south along the old cattle trail. That wrapped the ridge. The path was narrow, choked with brush, but he knew it well. About 2 miles out, he dismounted, tied the horse in a thicket, and moved on foot. Widow Hollow lay spread beneath him, small and quiet under the gray morning sky. He watched for an hour, watched the man from the general store, the blue coat, the tidy beard. He watched him speak to 2 others, strangers who didn't belong, hired men. Grady returned by midday, his face hard. "You were right," he told Ellie. "He's calling others." "How long do we have?" "A day, 2 if they ride slow. Then we fight." He looked at her, surprised. She stepped forward, handed him the baby, and said, "You're not the only one willing to bleed for this place." They spent the day preparing. Grady set traps along the northern trail, reinforced the barn doors, dug out an old pistol, and showed Ellie how to load and fire it. She listened without flinching. That night, they sat together on the porch, Samuel between them. "You still don't know what I ran from," she said. "You don't have to tell me. I want to." He turned, listening. "I married Thomas Greeley when I was 17. Or rather, I was sold to him. My father owed him. Greeley saw. He had his payment. I was his wife by name, servant by truth." Grady clenched his fists. "When I got pregnant, he changed. Thought the baby would trap me. I think he planned to take the child and send me east. Maybe worse. So I ran." "He'll come," Grady said. "He always does." Grady looked at the boy. "Then we make sure it ends here." The first shot came at dawn. It cracked through the cold air and shattered the window beside the hearth. Ellie dropped to the floor, cradling Samuel. Grady yanked her behind the table and fired back. The hillside erupted with noise. 3 men came from the east tree line, rifles raised. Grady picked one off from the doorway, then ducked as bullets splintered the frame. "Burn!" he yelled. Ellie ran low, fast. Samuel held tight. Grady covered her, firing as he backed toward the barn. Inside, they slammed the doors and braced them with the feed bin. "They'll come around," he said. She handed him the baby, loaded the pistol. "Then we meet them." He kissed Samuel's forehead. "You stay hidden." Grady stepped into the open just as two men reached the back of the barn. One went down fast. The other tried to run. "Drop it!" Grady shouted. The man hesitated. Then a shot rang out. He fell forward. Ellie stood behind him, the pistol smoking in her hand. Silence fell. Grady checked the bodies, then looked east. A figure on horseback. Thomas Greeley. Grady walked forward. Greeley dismounted. "Where is she?" "Gone." "Liar." Grady raised his rifle. "Leave now, or I bury you here." Greeley laughed. "You think this ends today?" "I know it does." And then he fired. Greeley hit the ground, still smiling. Later, as the sun climbed high, Grady buried the bodies. Ellie stood beside him, Samuel asleep against her chest. She touched Grady's arm. "It's done." He looked at her. "No, it's just begun." They turned toward the cabin. Smoke still drifted from the chimney. The porch was scarred, the windows broken. But it stood. So did they. And in the valley below, the wind changed. The cabin still smelled of smoke and gunpowder, but the silence was clean. It was the kind of quiet that comes after thunder, where every breath feels like a borrowed miracle. Grady stood by the front window, arms crossed, eyes scanning the tree, line that had birthed death just days ago. The land looked peaceful again, the way it had when he first bought it. But it wasn't the same. Neither was he. Inside, Ellie moved slowly as she swept up broken glass and reset the few remaining dishes on the shelf. Samuel cooed in the cradle by the hearth, safe beneath a new quilt she'd stitched from scraps. The child didn't cry. Hikea didn't have to. His mother had learned how to make him feel safe in a world that wasn't. Silas arrived mid-morning. He came riding hard from the southern trail, rifle strapped across his back, eyes squinting against the wind. "Heard gunfire?" he said, dismounting. "Then the storm. Figured I'd best check if you were ghosts." "Not ghosts," Grady replied. "Just different men than we were." Silas looked at the bullet-riddled barn, the shattered window. "Reckon so." Ellie came out onto the porch with coffee. She handed Silas a tin cup and nodded. They didn't say much. Didn't need to. The bodies were gone, buried on the ridge where no wild dog would dig. But memory stayed. "So what now?" Silas asked. "You rebuild or ride?" Grady glanced at Ellie. "We stay," she said before he could answer. "This is home." The next days were filled with repair. Silas helped Grady replace the windows, mend the fence, patch the barn roof. Ellie planted a garden behind the cabin, turned the soil with her bears, hands and stubborn will. She worked in silence, sleeves rolled to her elbows, sweat streaking her brow. Grady tried not to stare but failed often. She noticed and didn't mind. One evening after supper, Grady took the guitar down from the rafters. It hadn't been touched in years. He ran his fingers along the neck, then sat on the porch and strummed. "Didn't know you played," Ellie said. "Don't much. Used to. My wife liked it. She must have had a good ear." He smiled, just once, then began to play something soft, something old, a hymn maybe, or just a tune from the back of the world. Samuel stirred in his sleep but didn't wake. Ellie sat beside Grady, closer than before. She didn't say anything, neither did he. The music said enough. On Sunday, Silas rode to Stillwater to bring back news. He returned with supplies and a letter. Grady took it, saw the seal, government. He broke it open with a knife and read slowly. "They want me to testify," he said, "against Greeley for what he did to Ellie." Ellie stiffened. "I can't go back there," she whispered. "You don't have to. I will." "It won't change anything." Grady folded the letter. "Maybe not. But it tells the world what happened. Makes it harder for men like him to hide." Ellie nodded slowly. "Then I'll write my part," she said. "Even if I never set foot in that courthouse." The days passed soft. A rhythm returned. Grady rose early, tended stock. Ellie baked, cleaned, watched Samuel crawl across the porch like he owned the world. Silas built a small bunkhouse nearby, swore he'd stay until the boy turned 20, or he was too old to hold a hammer. Grady laughed more. Ellie smiled more. Samuel grew. One night a storm came fast. Rain hammered the roof. Wind shook the windows. Grady held Samuel while Ellie paced. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Used to be. Storm scared me. Reminded me of doors breaking open, of yelling." "And now? Now I just hear rain?" Grady handed her the baby. "You changed everything." "No," she said. "You did, when you didn't send me away." They stood like that for a long time. Then he said the words he'd been carrying. "Marry me." She blinked. "Grady, not because of the boy, not because of the past, because I want to build a life. With you." She looked at Samuel, then at him. "Yes." Outside, the thunder rolled on, but inside there was peace. They married in the clearing, just beyond the tree line. Silas officiated, wearing a clean shirt, and tears he blamed on dust. A handful of neighbors came. Agnes from the hollow brought bread. Someone played a fiddle. Ellie wore a dress she made herself. Samuel wore boots too big. Grady took her hands and promised nothing fancy, just protection, respect. A fire that wouldn't go out. She promised love. That night the stars hung low, the fire burned bright, and Grady, who once thought the world had no more warmth for him, fell asleep beside the woman who proved otherwise. In the dark, Ellie whispered, "You kept your promise," and he did every day after. The Wyoming wind shifted, gentler than it had been in weeks, as though the land itself had exhaled. For once the sky above the homestead was wide and clean, with only a few high clouds trailing like pale lace. Birds had returned to the pine tops, calling to one another. The world was waking again, and so were they. Grady Lorne stood on the porch, arms crossed over his chest. A man not used to rest, he looked like he didn't quite trust the peace that had settled over the land. But it was there. You could feel it in the way the grass whispered, in the way the shadows lay long and slow across the ground. Inside, Ellie was humming, just low and soft, enough to make the walls seem warmer. She was baking again, not out of necessity, but out of comfort. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and old hope. Her hands moved with purpose, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back. Samuel, now crawling faster than a rabbit on a hot trail, squealed with delight as he chased a wooden spoon across the floor. He laughed when he smacked his little fist on it, proud of every echo. Grady came in, mud on his boots, hat low. "He's gonna outrun me soon." Ellie smiled, brushing flour from her cheek. "You? No chance." He looked at the baby. "Man's got fight in him." She nodded. "Comes from both sides." Grady leaned in, kissed her temple. A gesture quiet and sure, like the sun hitting the canyon wall at dawn. "You ever think it had come to this?" he asked. Ellie paused, watching Samuel. "No, I thought I'd be running for the rest of my life." Grady nodded. "So did I." They stood there, a moment, hand in hand, watching their son crawl toward the firelight. Spring meant more than warmth. It meant expansion. Grady had plans, small at first, fencing off the east pasture, getting chickens again, maybe trading for another milk cow. Silas had promised to help when he returned from Stillwater, where he'd gone to check on Agnes and deliver some supplies. Ellie had plans too. She'd started sketching, nothing formal, just drawings in the margins of the ledger book, a new room for Samuel, a proper pantry. Maybe even a wash house if the summer held, but more than that, she'd started writing, late at night, after Samuel. Slept after Grady had gone quiet in the big chair near the hearth. She would sit at the table with a candle stub and the journal. Page by page, she was telling her story. Not the one the world had written for her, but the one she'd lived. She didn't spare herself. She didn't make Greeley into more monster than man. He was bad enough already. But she told the truth about what it felt like to be owned, about the ache of carrying a child into a future she couldn't see, about the fear and the fire and the moment she saw Grady's eyes and knew she'd found the edge of the world, and the beginning of a new one. She wrote it for Samuel, so that someday he'd know who his mother was, who his father became, and what it cost to find home. By mid-April, the garden had begun to sprout. Little green shoots poked out like the land was whispering back, "I remember you. I remember hope." Grady built a new clothesline. Ellie hung Samuel's little shirts and watched them flutter like promises in the wind. That night, as they sat on the porch with warm mugs of cider, Grady reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. "What's that?" Ellie asked. He handed it to her. Inside was a tin badge, worn, bent at one edge. Used to be a lawman before everything. She looked at it, then at him. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because I think it's time I start living like a man, worth trusting again." She held the badge in her palm. "You already are." He stared at her for a long time. Then, quietly, almost afraid to believe it, he said, "Then maybe we use that name, the Lorne name. Give it to Samuel. Give it to this land." Ellie blinked fast, her throat tight. "I'd like that," she said. "A lot." The next morning, Grady rode into town. He went to the town hall, signed the papers, took Ellie's old last name off the land deed and put her new one there instead. He filled out Samuel's birth certificate, late but legal. Wrote his name in full, Samuel Grady Lorne. He didn't say much on the way home, but when he rode up to the cabin and saw Ellie out front, he handed her the documents and said, "It's official now. This is our land, our name." She kissed him without a word, and the wind blew just right, soft and proud. That night, Grady stood in the doorway, silhouetted by lamplight, watching Ellie rock Samuel to sleep. She hummed again, same tune. As before, a song of home, a song of names earned, not given. He watched them, and something deep inside settled. Not every story ended in gunfire. Some ended in peace. Some began again, like theirs. Chapter 9, Legacy in the Dust. The wind came down from the canyon like a slow breath, stirring the grass with a whisper that only those who listened close could hear. It was early August now. The garden was thriving, the smokehouse curing meat in the thick, dry air, and the sound of Samuel's laughter had become a regular part of the landscape. Grady had taken to walking the perimeter of the property every morning after sunrise, sometimes with Samuel on his shoulders, the boy clapping and babbling nonsense as they inspected fence posts and looked for signs of coyotes. This was the life he had once never dared imagine, daily, rooted, simple. But within that simplicity was a richness he'd never known. On the morning of his birthday, though he told no one, Grady found a note tucked into his boot by the door. The paper was stiff and folded clean, and the writing was Ellie's. "For the man who gave me silence without fear, work without burden, and love without demand. Happy birthday, Grady. You're everything we needed. Love, Ellie." He stood there a long time with the note in his hand. Samuel watched from his crate, chewing on a bit of leather. Grady gave him a wink, tucked the note in his pocket, and stepped outside to chop wood. That afternoon, Silas brought back a surprise from Stillwater, a small upright piano, its wood scuffed but intact. Traded 2 pigs, a bottle of rye, and a favor I can't talk about, Silas said as they lowered it from the wagon. Ellie stared at it, eyes wide. "Where did you even find one?" "Old church was closing down. Pastor said it still sings. Just needs a softer touch." That night she played. Her fingers were rusty, halting at first, but the melody came. Samuel clapped. Grady listened from the porch, smoking a pipe. The stars overhead like watchful eyes. The song she played had no name, but it sounded like coming home. The heat grew worse as August deepened. Crops needed extra watering, and the goats had to be corralled during midday to avoid sunstroke. Ellie's pregnancy was further along, her belly full and firm, her breath coming shallower as the baby grew. Grady built her a stool for the kitchen, made sure the rocker was always by the breeze-facing window. Every time she stood up too fast, he was there. Every time she sighed, he heard it. "You're hovering," she said one morning. "You're waddling," he replied with a grin. She narrowed her eyes. "Careful, Mr. Lorne." But she was smiling. That night she woke to cramps, not contractions. Just the body adjusting, straining. "You all right?" Grady asked, propping himself up. She nodded. "Just stretching, I think. Everything's getting ready." He rubbed her back until she slept and stayed awake long after. By mid-month the valley was beginning to brown. Summer had reached its peak, and the wind smelled like dust and distance. Silas organized a small harvest gathering, just the Lornes, Evelyn and her daughters, and 2 ranch hands from a neighboring spread. They grilled venison, passed whiskey, and danced barefoot on the porch. Ellie danced, too. Grady watched her sway with Clara in her arms, her face tilted to the sky. "You're staring," Silas said. "Just counting blessings," Grady replied. "Careful," Silas said. "Too many of those and the sky gets jealous." Grady looked at his son, his wife, the land. Let it try. One morning, a stranger rode in. He was lean, dust-covered, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. His horse was lathered, the kind of animal that had been ridden hard and long. Grady met him at the gate. "Lost?" The man raised his hands. "Name's Harmon. Looking for a girl named Ellie Monroe. Said she might be out this way." Grady's jaw set. "What for?" "Ain't trouble. Just news. She got a cousin passed, left her a parcel of land near Kansas. City. Didn't want to write. Figured I'd deliver it proper." Grady studied him. "Stay here." He went inside. "Ellie was shelling peas again?" "Visitor. Says you had a cousin." She blinked. Slowly set down the bowl. "Is it a lie?" "Don't smell like one, but I'll send him packing if you want." She stood. "No, I'll hear it." They met on the porch. Harmon removed his hat. "Sorry for the abrupt visit, ma'am. A Mr. Langford died 2 weeks ago. No next of kin except a cousin. You." Ellie nodded slowly. "He was my mother's brother. Haven't seen him since I was a child. He left you a title deed. Not much, but there's some acreage. House needs work. Still, it's yours." He handed her the paper. Ellie held it, uncertain. "You can take your time," Harmon said. "Just needed to make sure you got it." She thanked him. He rode off by dusk. That night, by firelight, she showed the deed to Grady. "Would you ever want to leave?" she asked. He shook his head. "Only if you needed to." She touched her belly. "I want to stay, but maybe one day we give Samuel something else, something more. Then we build it, here or there. Wherever you are is home." As the month ended, the first hints of fall came on the wind. Grady fixed the roof. Ellie sewed. Silas plotted a smokehouse of his own, and Samuel, ever-growing, stood on his own feet for the first time without falling. They cheered, and the land, bathed in golden light, seemed to cheer too. They were no longer running, they were planting legacy, one sunrise at a time. The first signs of September swept across the valley with a whisper, not a roar. A golden hush settled over the land, as if the world itself were taking a breath between the heat of summer and the silence of snow. The cottonwoods along the creek wore leaves tinged with amber. The air, while still warm, carried with it the first crisp notes of the coming season. At the Lorne homestead, life had shifted in subtle ways. The rhythms that once felt new had grown into routine. Grady rose each morning before the sun touched the hilltops, but now he lingered for a few quiet minutes on the porch, sipping coffee from a dented tin cup while watching Samuel wobble toward the chicken coop, one stubby hand dragging a stick behind him like a sword. Ellie's belly had grown round and full. She moved slower now, her feet swollen by midday, her back aching more often than not. But there was grace in her movement, a quiet strength that hadn't faded since the day she arrived. She still cooked, still cleaned, still cared for Samuel with tender devotion, but Grady had taken on more. He did it without being asked. He did it because he wanted to. He milked the goats in the early light and fed the chickens while Samuel watched. With solemn fascination, he turned the soil in the fallow garden beds and built a new trellis for the beans, muttering to himself as he worked, occasionally glancing back toward the house to make sure Ellie was resting. Silas, ever the watchful. Guardian took over wood chopping and barn repairs. When Evelyn and her daughters visited again in early September, Silas played fiddle while the girls braided wildflowers into Samuel's curls. Evelyn brought a basket of late summer plums and a needlepoint blanket for the new baby. "You thinking of a name yet?" she asked Ellie as they sat on the porch. Ellie smiled, one hand resting on her belly. "A few, but I want to meet her first." Evelyn nodded. "That's how I named mine. A woman ought to look her child in the eye before deciding who they are." The next week a letter arrived by horseback. The same circuit rider who delivered goods from Stillwater carried it in a canvas pouch slung across his back. "Grady Lorne?" he asked, tipping his hat. Grady nodded, accepting the envelope. It was addressed in a hand he didn't recognize. He opened it inside. Ellie watched him read, eyes narrowing slightly as his brow furrowed. "What is it?" she asked. He folded the letter. "A friend from before. Says he might be passing through. Wants to visit?" Ellie waited. "Is that all right?" he asked softly. She nodded. "If he's your friend, he's welcome." But something in Grady's expression lingered, even after he tucked the letter away. His name was Caleb Hart. When he arrived a week later, it was on a black gelding that bore the dust of hard travel. Caleb was tall, rangy, with a lean face and storm-colored eyes. He had the look of a man who'd slept under open skies for too long and stopped believing in fences. Grady met him at the gate. No words at first, just a nod. Then a brief embrace between two men who had once trusted each other with their lives. Caleb dismounted. "Place looks like something worth keeping." "It is." Ellie came out onto the porch, Samuel in her arms. She didn't smile right away, but she didn't retreat either. Caleb tipped his hat. "Ma'am, heard a lot about you. Wish I could say the same," she replied. He chuckled. "Fair enough." That night after supper, Caleb and Grady sat by the fire with Silas, sharing whiskey and stories from a past that sounded like another life. They spoke of places Ellie didn't know, battles fought in deserts and border towns, names of men long buried. Eventually, Caleb asked, "You ever think about riding again?" Grady looked at Ellie, who was humming to Samuel as she rocked him to sleep. "Not once." Caleb nodded slowly. "Didn't think so." Caleb stayed 2 nights, then rode off without fanfare. Before he left, he pressed a small silver coin into Samuel's palm. "For luck?" he said. "Not that he'll need it. Not with you two." Then he rode into the rising sun, a shadow of the man Grady once was, fading into the horizon. The final days of September came with a stillness. Ellie's time drew near. Grady stayed close. Silas built a cradle from aspen wood, sanding the corner smooth as a hymn. Evelyn visited daily. So did her girls. The house, once so quiet, now echoed with laughter, voices, and the low hum of a family growing. Ellie went into labor 3 days before the harvest moon. It was long, hard. Grady held her hand, whispering soft encouragement while Silas paced the yard and Evelyn boiled water. When the baby finally arrived, her cry rang out into the night like a bell calling the faithful. A girl. Healthy, strong, they named her Hope, not because they needed it, but because she was it. And so the homestead grew, not just in size, but in spirit. Where once there was only survival, now there was legacy. Where once there was silence, now there was music. Where once there was a man and a woman clinging to what was left of themselves, now there was a family. And in the threads of daily life, the chores, the stories, the quiet prayers whispered before sleep, they found something that could never be taken, something that would last. Chapter 11. Rooted and Rising. October came on the heels of harvest, and with it a quiet kind of celebration. The hills turned copper and rust, and the scent of earth hung thick in the morning air. It was the season of slowing down, of preparing for winter, and for the Lorne homestead, it was also the season of beginning anew. Hope, small and fierce-voiced, settled quickly into life. She slept in fits and starts, cried often, and quieted only in Ellie's arms, or when Grady hummed the slow, off-key lullaby he'd once learned from his mother. Samuel, now a toddling storm of motion, watched his baby sister with wide, curious eyes. He didn't yet understand her presence, but he felt the shift she brought, a new axis around which the house turned. Ellie, healing slowly, wore fatigue like a second skin but bore it with grace. She moved less than usual, took help when offered, and found herself crying at unexpected moments. The smell of bread baking, Samuel patting her arm, Hope clutching her finger in the dark. Grady stepped fully into the rhythm of family life. He rose earlier, worked faster, and stayed within earshot of the cabin most days. His face had grown leaner, weathered, but his eyes were clearer than they'd ever been. He split his time between fencing, drying meats for the cold season, and tending to repairs, the little things that made a home endure. Silas, officially, a part of the family now, took to teaching Samuel how to whittle, though most of their first attempts ended in blisters or broken sticks. He built a shelf above the hearth for Hope's baby things, and another above that for Ellie's books, which had multiplied thanks to a surprise shipment from Evelyn. Evenings were sacred. Dinner always came with stories, sometimes from Silas, often from Grady, and occasionally from Ellie, who had begun to speak more freely about her childhood, about her mother's garden in Kentucky, her father's banjo, the church bell that rang even in storms. It wasn't a fancy life, but it was theirs. Every step, every chore, every laugh stitched them tighter. One morning, snow teased the horizon. "Early," Grady said, glancing skyward. "Good," Ellie replied. "I'm ready to see the land turn quiet." With the turn in weather, Grady started sealing the cabin's edges. Silas helped reinforce the root cellar. Evelyn offered extra wool and helped knit mittens for Samuel, who refused to wear them more than 5 minutes at a time. Hope had her first cold. It passed quickly, but Ellie spent 3 sleepless nights with her bundled close, humming the same tune she'd once heard in a lullaby years ago. Grady never left her side, and when Hope finally slept through the night again, Ellie whispered, "You kept her safe." "You both did," Grady murmured. The first real snow fell in late October. It came overnight, blanketing the world in white silence. Samuel squealed with delight, stomping around in boots 2 sizes too big. Hope watched from inside, wide-eyed as flakes swirled outside the window. Grady and Silas cleared paths and laid out fresh straw in the barn. Ellie baked 3 loaves of bread, sending the smell wafting into every room. They ate supper around the fire, bellies warm, hearts warmer. Later, as the wind picked up and the fire crackled low, Ellie looked at Grady. "You still think about the past?" "Not like I used to." "How then?" he considered. "Like pages in a book I finished. Sometimes I reread a line. But I don't live there anymore." She nodded, touching Hope's soft hair. "Neither do I." November loomed, and with it the promise of deeper snow. But for now they had food, they had warmth, they had stories to carry them through the long dark, and, in the center of it all, they had each other, rooted and rising. The snow fell slow and steady that morning, drifting down like soft ash from a fire already burned out. Ellie stood at the window of the Lorne cabin, Hope in her arms, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the world blur into white. Grady was outside chopping wood beneath a sky the color of pewter, each swing of his axe muffled by the snowfall. Samuel sat cross-legged near the hearth, carefully lining up wooden animals in a parade across the floor. Life had found a rhythm, quiet, sacred, sometimes aching in its simplicity. And yet, beneath the surface, something stirred. "I think it's time," Ellie whispered to the baby in her arms. Hope stirred against her chest, a tiny hand clenching and unclenching near her collarbone. "I think we're ready." Grady noticed the shift in her before she said a word. He saw it in the way she lingered at the edge of the porch, gazing toward the road, in how she cleaned the kitchen with more thoroughness than needed, in how she packed and repacked a small leather bag that she hadn't touched in months. "You thinking about leaving?" he asked her one night, voice low but not accusing. She looked up from her chair by the fire, Hope asleep in her lap. "Not forever, just I need to go back." "For me?" Grady nodded, eyes steady. "You want me to come?" "Yes," she said, "but only if you're ready too." "I go where you go, Ellie," Silas grunted from the corner. "Reckon you two might make this old man cry one of these days." They left just after the thaw began. March sun had begun to nibble at the snowdrifts, and the air smelled faintly of earth and sap. The journey would be long, more than a week by wagon, but they were prepared. Morgan lent them fresh horses. Evelyn packed food enough to feed a small army. Clara gifted them a quilt stitched with initials and tiny wildflowers. "We'll be, back before summer," Ellie promised, hugging Evelyn tight. "You better be," Evelyn whispered, eyes misty, "or I'll come hunt you down myself." Silas was less sentimental. "Just don't name the next kid after me. Too much pressure." Grady chuckled. "No promises." And with that, they rode out. The road south was different than Ellie remembered. Towns had changed, faces had aged, but the shadows still whispered the same stories. Every mile brought old memories crawling back, of fear, of survival, of running. Hope was fussier during travel, unused to the wagon's bounce. Samuel, on the other hand, was delighted by everything: birds overhead, rivers under bridges, the sudden appearance of deer in the brush. Grady stayed vigilant, one hand always near his rifle. But the road stayed quiet. On the fifth day they reached the outskirts of the town where Ellie had once been a name on a ledger in a lawman's home. They approached at dusk. The town looked smaller somehow, the buildings more worn, the streets more rutted. But it was still the place she'd once called a prison. They stayed at the inn, took the large corner room with 2 beds and a stove that barely worked. Grady cooked rabbit stew over a fire pit behind the stable. Ellie sat with the children, her fingers twisting in her lap. "I don't know if he's still here," she murmured. "Doesn't matter," Grady said. "You're not here for him, you're here for you." She nodded. The next morning, she walked down the main street with Hope in her arms and Grady at her side. People stared, some whispered. A few looked away, but none stopped her. She passed the church where she'd once scrubbed floors on bleeding knees, the store where she'd been short-changed weekly, the alley where she'd first thought about escaping. Then she reached the sheriff's office. It wasn't the same man. That much was clear. A younger deputy stepped outside, saw her, and blinked in confusion. "You need help, ma'am?" "No," she said. "I just needed to see it." She turned to leave. They stayed 3 more days, long enough for her to visit the graveyard, to find the headstone of a girl she'd known, just 16 when she died in childbirth, her name forgotten by most. Ellie brought wildflowers and laid them on the grave. "You mattered," she whispered. Back at the inn, Samuel ran up to her, face bright. "Mama, I found a frog." She scooped him into her arms, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "Good, maybe. He'll turn into a prince." Samuel looked skeptical. "I don't want a prince. I want pie." Grady walked up behind her, chuckling. "There's a bakery down the road." "Let's go," she said. The journey home felt different, lighter. Hope slept easier. Samuel sang songs. Grady laughed more than she'd ever heard. And Ellie? She felt whole. She'd faced it, and now she could leave it. By April, they returned to the Lorne homestead. Morgan met them at the gate. Evelyn cried again. Silas muttered something about chickens escaping. Home. That night, as the stars came out and the cabin filled with familiar sounds, Ellie stood on the porch with Grady. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I think I finally believe it." "Believe what?" "That we made it." He pulled her close. They stood in silence, together, rooted, and rising. The sky was red that morning, a deep burning red like iron pulled from the coals. It washed the valley in rust, casting long shadows from the trees and making the world feel hushed, reverent, like it was bracing itself. Grady stood by the corral, one hand resting on the fence, watching the horses stir. The frost clung to their coats in delicate patterns, the way ice forms on glass before it melts away with the day. Inside the cabin, Ellie stirred biscuit dough with one hand and rocked Hope with the other. The fire crackled behind her, the smell of burning pine mixing with flour and warmth. Samuel, now nearly 4, sat at the table humming to himself, coloring with a stub of charcoal on scrap paper. It had been 2 months since they returned from Ellie's old town. 2 months of stillness, of healing, of quiet days stacked like firewood against the threat of whatever might come next. But peace, Ellie had learned, wasn't something that arrived all at once. It came in pieces, in slow mornings, in steady hands, in the way Grady always looked back over his shoulder to make sure she was still there. That afternoon, Evelyn rode in with Clara perched behind her, cheeks pink from the wind. "We brought cinnamon," Clara declared, holding up a small cloth pouch like it was treasure. Samuel whooped with delight. "Mama makes better pie with that." Ellie smiled. "Then I guess I have no choice but to make one." Grady emerged from the barn, brushing dust from his sleeves. "You bring enough for 2 pies?" he asked. Evelyn raised a brow. "You planning on sharing?" He gave a rare grin. "Not a chance." They spent the afternoon together. Clara helped Ellie in the kitchen. Samuel and Evelyn gathered eggs. Grady and Silas hauled in a new door to replace, the one with the bullet holes from the last winter's standoff. No one mentioned Thomas Greeley anymore. No one had to. Some ghosts don't disappear, but they do get quieter. Later that night, as pie cooled on the windowsill and Samuel snored softly, on a pallet near the fire, Ellie stepped outside to find Grady sitting on the porch with his boots up and a mug in his hand. "You ever think it's too good to be true?" she asked, wrapping the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Grady looked out at the stars. "Every day." "But you stay," he nodded. "Because you do." She sat beside him. The porch creaked under their weight. "Oye, want to do something?" she said. "All right. I want to teach. Reading, writing, for the kids in the valley. There are more families now, and not everyone can get to the town school." Grady studied her a moment, then nodded. "We'll build you a schoolhouse." She blinked. Just like that, just like that. He wasn't a man of many promises, but the ones he made, he kept. The foundation for the schoolhouse was laid by the next week. Neighbors showed up with shovels, Morgan brought nails, Evelyn drew plans. Even Clara got involved, organizing the children into helpers. Ellie stood in the middle of the site one afternoon, her skirt caked in mud, hair falling from her braid, hope strapped to her chest. She looked at the stakes outlining the future, and she felt it. Not survival, not escape, but purpose. That evening, Silas sat on the porch whittling a small horse from pine. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "this place, it ain't just a ranch anymore." Grady leaned against the post beside him. "No," he said, "it's a beginning." As the stars rose over the valley and the sound of hammers faded into crickets, Ellie wrote in her journal by lamplight, "We are not running any more. We are not hiding. We are not waiting for the past to catch us. We are building something new, a place for stories, a place for peace, a place for our children to grow where fear does not speak first. This, I believe, is what home truly means." Outside, the wind carried the scent of cinnamon and cedar. Inside, a new future was being forged, quiet but unshakable. The first real snow of winter came early that year, thick and clean, blanketing the valley like a promise. For days, the world outside the Lorne homestead was wrapped in white, quiet as prayer, but inside, the cabin was alive with the sounds of a life well earned. Hope toddled across the floor now, sturdy on her legs, a blur of curls and laughter. Samuel had taken to reading aloud every evening, practicing from the slim collection of books Ellie had brought down from the town library. Grady, for his part, was content to listen. He'd always been a man of action, but now he was learning the quiet art of presence. The schoolhouse rose beam by beam, walls braced against the wind. It stood near the eastern slope, a modest structure of pine and cedar with wide windows to catch the morning light. By the time the first bell rang in early December, 4 children arrived on foot and 2 by wagon. Ellie stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand, heart pounding. But when she looked at the children, clutching slates and biting their lips with nervous excitement, something inside her steadied. She began with letters, then names, then stories, stories of wild horses, of brave girls and boys who faced storms, and kept walking. Stories that mattered. Grady watched from the porch each morning as she walked out with Samuel and Hope bundled beside her. She had a stride now, confident, solid. And every evening when she returned with the children's laughter echoing behind her, he felt something settle deeper in his chest. A kind of peace he'd never thought he'd earn, Silas had taken over most of the barn work and declared himself assistant dean of ranch operations and fence repair. Morgan and Evelyn visited weekly, bringing news and food, and Evelyn helped Ellie draw up lesson plans while Clara played babysitter to the younger children. A rhythm, simple and sacred, began to shape the days, but even in peace, shadows linger. It came with the post, a letter, creased and weather-stained, addressed to Grady, inside, a name, Greeley, and a warning. The man had brothers, lawmen from Missouri. One of them had taken a new post in a town not far from the Wyoming border. Word had passed about a woman who'd disappeared and about a child with her eyes. Grady showed Ellie that night. Her face paled, but she didn't tremble. "Let him come," she said. "We'll be ready," Grady replied. But readiness wasn't just about guns or escape plans. It was about resolve. That winter, they dug deeper roots. Ellie taught every day. Grady fortified the homestead quietly. Silas built a second cellar, stocked it with supplies, but most of all, they lived. Not waiting, not fearing, but living. Hope said her first full sentence before Christmas, "Mama, look, snow angel." And that night, as they all lay beneath a roof built by scarred hands and quiet strength, Ellie whispered to Grady, "Even if they come, this is ours now. They can't take that." Grady held her close. "No, they can't." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft as forgiveness, deep as love. The winter deepened. Snow came in waves now, relentless and heavy, turning the valley into a world of muted whites and grays. The path to the schoolhouse disappeared for days at a time, and Grady had to dig it out each morning so Ellie could still walk the children to class. The ranch became a fortress again, but this time not against men, against the cold, against the hunger of winter. They weathered it together. Every morning, Grady chopped wood until his arms ached, then helped Silas carry it to the barn, the schoolhouse, and the cabin. Ellie baked more often, breads and thick stews, pies made from preserved apples and dried cinnamon. Hope grew restless indoors, but Ellie taught her games and songs, and Samuel, now reading books without prompting, began to write stories of his own. They made do. But beneath it all, the shadow of Greeley's kin lingered. Every rider that appeared on the horizon drew Grady's eye. Every creak of the trees at night made Ellie stiffen, but no one came. Not yet. One morning a telegram arrived. Silas rode to town for supplies and came back with it hidden in his coat. He handed it to Grady in the barn, face pale. "Postmark says Carver Junction, Missouri," he muttered. "Same last name?" Grady opened it slowly. Only 10 words, "Coming west, looking for the woman and the child." He didn't show it to Ellie right away. Instead, he walked out to the ridge behind the barn, the wind carving through his coat, and stared at the road that led out of the valley. He stayed there until his skin burned from the cold. That night, he told her. Ellie listened without speaking, then folded her hands in her lap. "We don't run," she said. Grady looked at her. "They could come with warrants, badges, and lies." He nodded. "And guns." She looked to the children asleep beside the fire. "Then we fight, not just for us, for this, for them." Grady didn't argue. He'd just reached for her hand, held it, and in the days that followed, preparations began. They fortified the barn, created a lookout on the ridge. Morgan and Evelyn rode in with supplies and weapons. Clara offered to take the children if things turned dangerous. "Not unless it comes to that," Ellie said. "They stay with us." The waiting was worse than the fighting. The tension threaded through each day, even as snow softened the landscape. But the valley held firm. The school remained open. Ellie kept teaching. Grady kept building. And in the quiet, a new strength took root, a strength that knew fear, but chose to stand anyway. And still, no one came. Not yet. February bled into March. The snow began to retreat. Buds appeared on the trees. The sound of water running under ice returned. Grady and Ellie walked the land every evening, checking fence lines, holding hands, saying nothing. On one such walk, Ellie stopped, pointed to a grove of pines. "Let's build a second cabin." Grady raised an eyebrow. "For who?" "For whoever comes next," she said. He looked at her, then nodded. "All right." And just like that, the future unfolded again, not without threat, not without memory, but with hope enough to keep going, because the valley wasn't just a place to survive anymore. It was a place to live, to grow, to defend. And when the road finally stirred with riders come to test that resolve, they'd find not fugitives or victims, but a family, rooted, ready, and unbreakable. The first hint of spring came not with blossoms, but with the sound of hooves on the southern trail. It was a gray morning, the sky a mottled slate above the thawing valley, when Samuel spotted movement from the schoolhouse window. A single rider, then two, then four. Dustless, slow, deliberate. Ellie had just finished leading Hope and two of the town's younger children through a song about wildflowers. She followed Samuel's gaze, her stomach tightening. Grady and Silas were already moving. The four riders came into view before the schoolhouse. All wore dusters, faces veiled in the kind of stillness that came from long miles and darker intentions. One bore a U.S. Marshal badge, tarnished, but real. Another rode with a Winchester on his back and a scar that split his lip in two. They stopped 50 paces out, close enough to be heard, far enough to demand they be approached first. Grady stood at the gate. "Name's Lorne. This is my land. State your business." The marshal dismounted. "Name's Randall Greeley. I've come for a woman and a child." Grady's jaw clenched. "Then turn around. There's no one here who belongs to you." Greeley didn't smile, but the man beside him did. A cruel little twist of a mouth. "I have paperwork," the marshal said, producing a folded warrant, signed in Missouri under federal seal. Ellie stepped into view. Her voice carried, clear and steady. "That paper's forged, and even if it wasn't, no man has the right to claim me, or my daughter." Greeley turned, saw her. For a second his face twitched. Not surprise, not rage, recognition, that quiet moment of a man confirming a target. "We're not here to hurt anyone, ma'am," he said. "We just need to bring you back east. There's still debts. Still questions." "You had your chance," Ellie replied, "and you lost it." Greeley stepped forward. Silas cocked his rifle. Grady didn't move. Behind them, the valley held its breath. The standoff lasted minutes that felt like hours. Morgan arrived with two ranch hands. Evelyn dismounted with her rifle unslung. The townspeople began gathering on the ridge, silent and watchful. Grady walked to the edge of his land. "If you cross that fence, this ends bad. You've no jurisdiction here." Greeley's jaw worked side to side. The man with the scar started forward, just one boot. The crack of Silas's rifle split the morning. The bullet struck the dirt inches from the man's foot. Greeley turned. "Is this how it goes, then?" "It is," Grady said. "You can leave with your pride, or you can leave in pieces." Silence. Then Greeley nodded once, sharp and bitter. They turned, mounted, rode out the way they came. Back in the cabin, Ellie sat in the rocker with Hope asleep in her lap. She stared into the fire, breath shaking. "I didn't think they'd leave," she whispered. Grady poured 2 cups of coffee. "They didn't come for justice, just for power. When they couldn't get it, they left." "What if they come back?" "Then we fight again," she nodded. "Then I'm tired of fighting." He knelt beside her. "Then we build. We build so big they can't tear it down." That spring they did. The second cabin rose by summer, a small barn beside it, a new irrigation ditch carved into the southern field. The schoolhouse doubled in size. Ellie began writing again, first in the journal, then letters, then lessons published in small-town papers. Grady taught Samuel to track, to carve, to care. Silas took to teaching Hope how to fish, how to read clouds, how to spot a lie before it's spoken. And when autumn came and the valley turned gold, they gathered together beneath the cedar tree. They told stories of how things had once been, of what they'd survived, of what they were building, a home, a life, a family. And when the stars came out, Ellie looked across the fire to Grady and said, "You remember when I said I didn't know what love was anymore?" He nodded. She smiled. "I do now." The fire cracked, and around it they stayed, unbroken, together, home.